Well, amen. The Lord is good. Good to see everybody here today. We made it another day, and so another week. And so we're kind of coming to the end of our series on the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua. And we went into some real graphic details of what happened to him in the scourging and the crucifixion, because I wanted to do that for the reason of, well, we just need to know what it was that he really did and what he really paid for us. And I think in some ways religion has kind of dumbed us down to the sacrifice that he really made. And so we went into some details on that. We're not going to go through that again. But we're coming up to the burial now. And I want to talk a little bit today about the burial of Jesus, what happened. There might be some things you don't know about, but there's some really, there's some interesting information, or history, I should say, surrounding the tomb of Jesus. And when the Emperor Hadrian came into power, and this was in 117 AD, he was a godless man, and he actually began destroying, I should say, every remnant of Judaism and Christianity that existed in Jerusalem at that time. And for instance, he abhorred Judaism so much that he actually built to Zeus in the place where the Jewish temple once stood. And so he built the temple to Zeus there. And then when he discovered the tomb of Jesus, he actually built a temple to the goddess Aphrodite on top of the tomb of Jesus to try to hide it forever. But one thing I've found about with the Lord over the years, and you've probably found this as well, that oftentimes, you know, when the devil tries to use something against us, it will be the very thing that God will use for us. And so many years later, there was a fellow by the name of Constantine, and he actually became the emperor at that time, and his mother, Helena, and himself actually began restoring all the sacred Christian sites at that time. And so he gave orders to demolish the temple of Aphrodite, which was built on the top of the tomb of Jesus, or his burial site. And he gave orders at that particular time, well, to build something else on it. But his Hadrian, I should say, his attempt to conceal the tomb actually served to preserve it. And so Constantine was overseeing the building of what they called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built on top of the tomb of Jesus. And of course, Christians have been visiting this place for 1,700 years or so. And although there's other locations that claim to be the burial place of Jesus, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has actually been identified as the historic place from which he was actually, the tomb actually happened and where he was buried. So during a time now after the resurrection of Jesus, there were circulating rumors. Of course, the rumors were that he never actually died in the first place. All right. And of course, now how that couldn't have been dispelled based just upon what he went through, just in the scourging alone. No one would have likely have lived for that, but not to even mention the death on the cross. But some had said, or the rumor was spreading, that he was actually alive when he was placed inside the tomb, and he simply came out after he had rested for a while and recovered. But you wouldn't recover from something like that so easily. And others allege that his disciples came and stole the body from the grave and then claimed that he had been resurrected. These were some of the popular rumors that were circulating at that time. But Jesus' death, or the death of Yeshua, was really no hoax at all. Just as he really lived, he actually really died as well. And of course, 3 days later, he was raised back to life. And well, these truths are historical and well documented. And the truth is, they're really central to everything that you and I believe. So without no resurrection, there is no salvation. And so John 19:41 says that, now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre wherewith was never man yet laid. So the word garden here is actually the word kapos, and it actually describes any garden with trees and spices. So it can also mean an orchard. And so, well, it's the same word used to describe the Garden of Gethsemane, which we know was an olive tree orchard, all right? So there was a beautiful garden near the place of the crucifixion, and in the garden there was a new sepulcher. Now, the word new here actually describes something fresh, or we might say something that was unused. It was never used before that particular time. So there was a fresh, never before used tomb that was in the garden that had recently been chiseled out of the rock. Now, Matthew chapter 27, verse 57 through 60 tells us that the tomb actually belonged to a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Jesus's disciple. All right, so and then of course it says Joseph, we know, said he went to Pilate and he actually begged the body of Jesus. So then Pilate, of course, commanded the body to be delivered. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. So now, once again, not to get graphic, but if you can imagine, the body of Jesus did not look as it did when he walked on the earth because of the scourging that he'd been through. The Bible talks about, and we went through this, about in Isaiah, how it talked about his image was so marred that even the people that walked with him wouldn't have recognized him. They wouldn't have even known who he was. All right. And so the word hone here actually means this. It means to cut out of a rock, but then afterwards to highly polish. So this was a rich man's tomb, and it implies a special, highly developed, refined tomb, or a tomb that was actually splendid and expensive. And so most people in Israel were just buried in simple tombs with hinged doors, not a tomb that was made out of rock that was highly polished like that. And interesting, the fact that the tomb was hewn out of the rock, it's also mentioned in Matthew chapter 27, verse 60, also in Mark chapter 15, verse 46, and then in Luke chapter 23, verse 53. So this repeated fact that it's mentioned in all these places actually confirms that Joseph of Arimathea was actually a very wealthy man, all right? And the fact that Isaiah noted this in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 9, saying that he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. And so, Jesus, we know, died a criminal's death, or an execution, but he was actually buried in a rich man's tomb. So, Joseph, of course, had recently had the tomb. The reason Joseph got the tomb in the first place was that he had the tomb made for himself, all right? But since he was still alive and Jesus has died, he decided to dedicate the use of this tomb that he had made for himself to the Lord. And so John chapter 19, verse 42 tells us that when they laid Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. So the word lay here actually means this, or laid. It simply means to set or to place, to lay, to deposit, or we might say even to set in place. So it's actually used in this verse to describe how carefully placed Jesus' body was into its resting place inside the tomb. So even though his body was shredded, it was wrapped in linen and was handled very, very carefully after that. And so Joseph of Arimathea, and he had a friend, and that friend's name, you might recognize this name, but his name was Nicodemus. Joseph and his friend Nicodemus had ceremonically cleansed the body of Jesus, and very interestingly, they wrapped it into 100 pounds of spices. Now, that's a lot of spices, all right, preparing him for his burial. And so they had spent hours hovering over him during this process. And of course, if there'd been any flicker of pulse or whisper of breath lift in his lungs, of course, they would have known it, but there was none because he was dead, all right? His spirit had left the body, all right? So these men were not alone. Luke chapter 23, verse 55 tells us, it said, "And the women also, which came with him from Galilee, followed after and beheld the sepulchre, and how his body was laid." So the word beheld here in the Greek actually means this. It means to gaze upon, to fully see, or to look intently. We may even use the word examine, and this word is the Greek word, it's the Greek word theomai, and it's actually where we get the word theater from, okay? And so by using this word beheld, it actually indicates that the women here did not rush in and rush out of the tomb. Instead, they watched every act and every movement of his burial as if they were in a very theater, all right? And so with eyes wide open, they saw themselves, they were witnesses of how the body of Jesus was laid. So the word how here actually describes careful contemplation and very careful observance. So once again, they were examining everything that happened. They intently gazed on the burial of Yeshua and observed everything about it, all right? And so Mark's gospel verifies this. It says here in Mark chapter 15, verse 47, it says, "And Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph, behold where he was laid." So here the word beheld is used in a little bit of a different tense. Specifically, it means that they continually gazed upon Jesus, all right? So this verse could be translated, if we were to paraphrase what this actually means, it would be that they carefully contemplated where and how he was laid. So his body was not handled roughshodly after his death, but that is, they stayed there a while, and they actually took their time to look upon the body of Jesus in burial clothes and then to take some time and reflect. All right. So the reason they paused and pondered was that they didn't think they would ever see him again. All right, at that point, they didn't understand everything. So this was their final farewell as the one that they deeply loved, all right? And so, of course, after Jesus had carefully, or I should say after Joseph had carefully laid the body of Jesus in that fresh, highly polished stone tomb, all right, and everyone said goodbye, Matthew chapter 27, verse 60 tells us that Joseph rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. So as far as he was concerned, Jesus was buried, and that was the end of it. All right? But sorrow, of course, gripped the hearts of all the disciples at that time, and of course, fear gripped the hearts of the religious leaders. And of course, they were concerned that somehow Jesus' death was a hoax, or that his disciples were going to come at night and then steal his body. All right. So, and of course, and then they were going to, under a hoax, claim that his body was resurrected. So the religious people were afraid of that at that time. So Matthew chapter 27, verse 62 explains, it says, "Now the next day they followed the day of preparation. The chief priests and Pharisees came together with Pilate, saying, 'Sir, we remember that deceiver said while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Command, therefore, that the sepulchre be made sure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people, he is risen from the dead, so the last heir shall be even worse than the first.'" All right, so notice now what the religious leaders requested. First of all, they said, "Command, therefore, that the sepulchre be made sure." Now, what does that mean when it said be made sure? Well, the word sure here actually describes a legal seal that was placed on documents, letters, or possessions, all right? So in other words, when the seal is placed on there, you could tell if they were opened, all right? So in this passage, the seal was actually placed upon the tomb, all right? And of course, the purpose of the seal was to authenticate that the tomb was sealed in the first place. All right. And of course, in this case, Jesus' body had been properly inspected before sealing and all the contents were in order. So as long as the seal would remain unbroken, it guaranteed that the contents were safe, sound, and undisturbed. All right. So now, more than likely, the religious leaders at that particular time were asking that a string of some kind be stretched across the entrance of the tomb and sealed on both sides by Pilate himself's official seal. All right. And so he was the governor, we know, of Judea, and no one was in any higher authority than him at that particular time in that area. So therefore, the seal of Pilate would have been very powerful and very important, and no one would dare break the seal of Pilate, all right, that was placed in there, because if someone would have broke that seal, they would have likely been executed on the spot. And so, according to the word sure now, the tomb couldn't be sealed until they first checked its contents. So for this to happen, the religious leaders, along with the Roman soldiers and officials from Pilate's court, would have had to go into the tomb and reopen it after Joseph sealed it. They had to make sure that Jesus was in there, the body was in there, and once they were satisfied with that, then they're going to reseal that, all right? So they had to roll away the stone, enter the tomb, and check everything to make sure that everything was in order, all right, so they could seal it, all right? So if they would have sealed that tomb and he wasn't in there, and then they find out later he's not in there, they would have all been executed. So their lives were on this line as well. So keep in mind now that Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, and the women were at this time unaware of what was taking place. When they sealed the tomb, they thought it's done. They left, they left the building. But as far as they knew, they had carefully prepared Jesus' body for burial and laid him to rest and sealed the tomb with a very large stone. All right. But now Pilate's officials, along with the Roman soldiers and religious leaders, went to the tomb. They rolled the stone away and entered inside to carefully inspect, all right, the body of Jesus, all right. Now they wanted to know that the body was still there, all right, and that he was also, not only was the body still there, but was he really dead? All right. And of course, so that's what they did, and they would have never sealed the tomb unless they had conducted a full inspection and, of course, affirmed that Jesus was there and that he was dead. All right. So, yet this wasn't enough. Now, the religious leaders still had doubts, and they continued to ask for more security. Now, in most cases, just having the seal of Pilate after they inspected the tomb, and then having Pilate put his seal on there would have been more than enough, all right? But the religious leaders, of course, were paranoid, so they asked for more security. So Matthew chapter 27, verse 65 tells us, it says, Pilate said unto them, you have a watch, go your way, make it as sure as you can. All right, so the word watch here actually means this. It describes a guard or a watch. All right, so in the first century, it actually would depict a group of Roman soldiers whose shift would change every 3 hours. Now, why would they change their shift every 3 hours? Because they had to keep them fresh, right? They didn't want them falling asleep on the job. All right, so the shift would rotate to ensure that the Roman soldiers were not only alert, but that they were fully awake the whole time for their shift, all right? And so when Pilate said, you have a watch, a better translation could render that, here, guys, I'm giving you a sect of soldiers. Take them and guard the tomb. So now, just think about the security on that tomb. I mean, they put a stone in front of the tomb, all right? And then Pilate puts his own seal on the tomb. And now they have a group of soldiers that are watching the tomb because they didn't want that body stolen and someone to say that, you know, that he actually rose from the dead, all right? And so, well, the word sure here actually means to provide added security or to assure that the security is properly achieved, all right? And so they went, of course, made the sepulchre sure. They sealed the stone, and then they set a watch after that, all right? So make no mistake, now we know Jesus was dead, and the centurion, remember, also had thrust his spear into the side of Jesus and, of course, saw a raw mixture of blood and water that flowed out. So this was confirmation of what we would call congestive heart failure, all right? And so this centurion then verified that Jesus was dead. And so next to Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus spent hours preparing the body for burial. And of course, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, were also present and assisting with gazing intensely at Jesus. All right, so if he would have moved a muscle, they would have known. They would have seen it. But clearly, there was absolutely no life that was left in his mangled body. He was dead. He was gone, all right? And if he'd been alive, of course, they would surely have known it. So, furthermore, now, the religious leaders at that time, along with the Roman soldiers and officials from Pilate's court, had all thoroughly examined the body in the tomb, and unevocably they came to one conclusion: he's dead. All right? So Romans knew about the death, and they were masters at inflicting it, so no one escaped a Roman crucifixion or scourging from dying. And of course, once they all verified that the body of Jesus was dead, they rolled the burial stone back in place, and Pilate's representatives sealed the tomb with the official seal of the Roman governor. And of course, that would have been Pilate. So all these things legally authenticated that Jesus was dead. So we're going to talk about on Wednesday his resurrection. We're going to get into the resurrection of the Lord and what happened to him. But let us not forget that, remember, what happened to Jesus after he died. There was still another penalty that he had yet to pay. He suffered for us on earth by, his body was mangled for our healing. He died on the cross for our sins, but now he must go to hell for 3 days and take the punishment that you and I deserved. So we'll maybe talk about that a little bit more on Wednesday. Someone asked Dee if she'd come up and lead us in communion at this time.